water so we can look for the conversation. So just a little bit of housekeeping before I turn it over to today's presentation. As always, please make sure your mics are muted throughout today's conversation and presentation. Um, if you have any questions or comments or concerns or issues throughout today's presentation, please utilize the chat feature to voice your comments and your questions. At the conclusion of today's conversation, we will have a Q&A session where I will be going through the chat feature to ask questions of today's presenter. Once we get through that and time permits, I can open up to more of a formal conversation, and you can ask questions or comments by utilizing the reaction, raise your hand feature, and I will get to you about that conversation. If you have any comments or technical questions throughout the conversation, send me a direct chat utilizing the chat feature, and we will go from there. But again, thank you for joining us for today's Water Walks. For today's conversation, I have the privilege of introducing not only a colleague, but a friend of mine. You have seen her all over the place this last spring semester as she's been up in Austin tackling our legislative session, our legislative agenda for this past session. I'd like to introduce Rachel Haynes, GEAA's policy director for today's conversation, and a little bit about Rachel's background. Rachel holds a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science in Spanish from Trinity University, located here in San Antonio, Texas, and a Master of Public Policy and Management from Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. She has multiple years of experience in the environmental water policy fields and in working within and with nonprofits and local, state, and federal agencies. Before joining GEAA, Rachel served 3 years as a program analyst for the U.S. Department of Interior, Bureau of Reclamation, and the Reclamation Law Administration Division, and later in the Colorado River Binational Program, working to help manage and conserve water in the West. So, great pleasure welcoming Rachel to today's Water Wonks lecture. She is going to be covering what happened in the 89th Texas Legislature and what's next for water. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Rachel, and the floor is yours, Rachel.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nathan, for the very kind introduction. And thank you all for joining us on this June afternoon as we are finished with the regular session of the 89th Texas Legislature and just found out we're facing down the barrel of at least one special session of the 89th Texas Legislature. I'll get into that further. We are happy to present today about what happened this past session and what's next, with a specific focus on laws related to water and how that will be impacting the Edwards and Trinity Aquifer region or the Texas Hill Country. So I'm just going to do a quick overview of where I plan on taking us this afternoon. I'm going to give a bit of an introduction on GEAA's, the Greater Edwards Aquifer Alliance's focus this past session. I'm going to go over some of the bills that we were advocating for, the so-called good bills, those that passed, those that died, and then I'll focus some on the so-called bad bills, or the bills that we were opposed to this session. We'll look at those that passed, we'll look at those that died, and then I'll give a quick overview of our next steps here at the Greater Edwards Aquifer Alliance and how we'll continue to work towards protecting our wonderful hill country and its creeks, streams, rivers, and groundwater. So some of you may have received some of our emails and our outreach and our policy documents earlier in the session back in January or February, or even back further in November, December of 2024, where we highlighted that we were going to focus our priorities of the session on these specific topics. There's a ton of bills that are passed every legislative session in Texas, and one organization could not possibly focus on all of them. And thankfully, we don't have to with GEAA. We are really just focused on bills and legislative topic areas that could impact groundwater and surface water supply and land use in the Hill Country and the Edwards and Trinity Aquifer region. So we were looking at bills that might have anything to do with water reuse, with land use, including extraterritorial jurisdictions, with city and county authority, anything related to water availability, to Texas Water Development Board funding and programs, and then to any bills that might have to do with flooding or stormwater management. And so that's what narrowed down. And I say narrowed, even though we had, I think, over 200 bills that we were tracking. But in the grand scheme of things, that is a pretty narrow list for the Texas legislature. And on the whole, we came out of this. My executive director and I have talked and done a retrospective, and I think we can say that we were pleasantly surprised with the outcome of this legislative session. It's always a concern going into a Texas legislative session of how the state of water and environment will fare. And for the bills that we were watching, again, we were pleasantly surprised at the outcome. So the statewide passage rate out of all of the bills that were filed in the House and Senate combined, 13.5% of those bills passed. That doesn't sound like a lot, and to be fair, it's not, but it is fairly average for the Texas legislature. They don't normally pass much more than around 15% of all bills filed. Thankfully, for the bills that we were supportive of, that we advocated for, that we testified on, in support of, that we worked with lawmakers on, we actually saw a 14.5 percentage point passage rate, which is just 1 percentage point better than the statewide average, which is, I think, a small pat on the back. We were really happy to see that, and it just means that responsible, rational environmental and water bills fared even better than the statewide average for all bills. And on that same note, for the bills that we opposed this session, for the bills that we advocated against and that we got our members out to advocate against, only 8.3% of those passed. So we actually did 5 percentage points better on those bills than the statewide passage rate, which, considering the impact of those bills, is a really good victory for our group and for any groups and citizens concerned about water and land use in the Hill Country. And you can find out a lot more in-depth information about everything that I'm going to say in this presentation with these 2 links here, and then I'll have the same links at the bottom of the session. And you're welcome to go to the Aquifer Alliance website and to our library, and you'll see all of this information there for you. So let's get into the good stuff, the good bills that passed this session. The main 2 bills that I think most people in Texas might have heard at least a little bit about, but that are very, very exciting, and we're going to continue to push for them, are Senate Bill 7 and House Joint Resolution 7. These are the bills, if you've heard anything in the news about the good water bills or the big water bills, it's these 2 bills. So Senate Bill 7 is an expansion of really critical water funding legislation that was passed in 2023, so the last legislative session, and it does some good things that we're really excited about. It adds water and wastewater reuse projects to projects eligible for funding under the new Water Supply for Texas Fund. It adds wastewater infrastructure projects to eligible Texas Water Fund projects. And so these are 2 areas that really need funding in the state if we're going to tackle a lot of our serious critical issues facing water supply and water infrastructure in Texas. And so to see those be eligible for funding is really great news. It also requires the Texas Water Development Board to incorporate wastewater planning into the state water planning process, which again is really great news considering, it's a water cycle. We've learned about that since elementary school. You can't separate the wastewater from the water in planning. And so being able to know that wastewater planning will be incorporated into the whole state water planning process is very encouraging for making good progress going forward. A lot of the fight that you may have heard about in the news, the back and forth, the late night sessions on Senate Bill 7 had to do with how the water was going to be funded. The Senate version of the bill that was originally filed differed quite drastically from the House version of the bill that was filed, and in a very good legislative compromise, ended up being a 50-50 split between the 2 bills. So about 50% of the funds will go towards the Texas Water Development Board for funding critical, oversubscribed existing projects. So things like leaking pipes, aging infrastructure, the flood infrastructure fund, things like that. About 50% of the new funds will be available for those projects. The other 50% of funds will go towards the new water supply fund. And like the name suggests, this is for projects like water and wastewater reuse, for desalination, recycling of produced oil and gas water, and for shovel-ready reservoir projects. And then there will be about up to 500 million for the Texas Water Fund. However, we like to note that this will only happen if House Joint Resolution 7, so the constitutional amendment that will allocate funding, is passed in November. So constitutional amendments in Texas must be voted on by the general population in the November election following the legislative session. So House Joint Resolution, which dedicates $1 billion annually to fund water supply and water infrastructure investments in Texas for the next 20 years, so it'll be 20 billion in total, must be approved by the public in November before we see that water funding. So I'm going to talk about it at the very end of the presentation, but this is just something to keep in the back of your mind. Yes, very good movement has been made on Texas water infrastructure and supply funding, but we haven't quite crossed the finish line yet. So getting into some other bills that passed that we're very excited to see, I call these the small but mighty fixes. To the general public, they may not seem like they do a lot. To those on the ground working in groundwater management, they are fairly large bills, and we're really excited to see them go through. Again, I'm not going to go through each bill in great detail. You can read plenty more on our website with all the materials we have posted, but I'll just give a general overview. So for groundwater conservation districts, they saw a lot of movement this session, maybe not as much as we hoped for all of the bills, but still significant positive steps forward. They now have to consider whether a proposed use of water unreasonably will affect exempt wells, so those small domestic wells have not previously been considered in any proposed permitting. They now have to be considered, which will hopefully help make sure that groundwater planning is done in a more responsible manner, in a more scientific manner. They can use export fees that water is being exported out of their district boundaries. The fees that are associated with that can be used to address the impacts of that export or of any other groundwater development. And then groundwater conservation districts also have to update their desired future conditions. I think it's every 5 years, and they have to show how they are meeting those desired future conditions and all of the tracking requirements. So it just broadens the transparency and accountability of groundwater conservation districts' efforts. Then we have some higher penalties for rules violations. So if there are violations of permitting or other rules in groundwater conservation districts, especially by large water projects, there are now higher penalties, and hopefully those will deter some of the more egregious egregious violations we've seen in the region. On the local side, so for counties, public utilities, and cities, we've seen some positive steps forward there too. We've got some bills that would require large utilities to undergo water loss reporting, auditing, and then water loss mitigation. This is really important. I think a lot of the talk this session has been about how egregious the water loss is in the state due to our aging infrastructure and our leaking pipes. I think it's we lose about as much as some of the 5 largest cities in the state every year to just general water loss and leaking pipes. So having these large utilities be required to undergo this reporting, auditing, and mitigation will be extremely helpful, and hopefully they can take some of that money that will be established in Senate Bill 7 and HJR 7. HOAs, homeowners associations, will now be prohibited from fining their residents for dead grass or brown grass during mandated drought restrictions. That's been a loophole that has put a lot of people between a rock and hard place financially, because on one hand, the HOA would ding you, but if you keep your grass green, on the other hand, your water utility would ding you. So this helps solve that loophole and can hopefully help a lot of areas address their water use during times of drought. There's also some small fixes that allow for more cross-governmental water planning and research, and some updated energy and water conservation codes that can be adopted by cities. One of the big ones that we're really excited to see is a clarification that private and investor-owned utilities can, in fact, enforce their drought contingency plans. There's been some legal back and forth on whether they were allowed to do that, similarly to how public utilities could, and this law makes clear that, yes, they can enforce their drought contingency plans. For state agencies, we've had some really positive movement. Again, I keep saying that, but it is just still exciting to see what we came out of the session with. We have on the Devils River, which is in, I think, Kinney and Uvalde and counties down south of our region in the Hill Country, a law that would restrict any new wastewater discharges into certain parts of the Devils River and to its watershed. This is considered one of the most pristine streams in Texas, and so knowing that we're able to protect it going forward is really huge news. And hopefully we can use that to gain momentum next session for protecting all of the pristine streams in Texas. We've got some bills for the Railroad Commission that would help them with their environmental enforcement and requiring oil and gas companies to plug certain orphan wells. We fixed some loopholes with the TCQ waste discharge system and for groundwater contamination notifications. And then on the reuse side, we have a bill that would let treated recycled water be used in aquifer storage and recovery projects. And then a bill or a part of the budget that directs the Texas Water Development Board to study the feasibility of whether quarries in the Edwards Aquifer region can use recycled water instead of groundwater for their operations. So that's all really exciting news. We're just very pleased to see those bills go forward. It was a lot of effort by our group, by our member groups, by other groups who are aligned on these issues. And so, and once again, just very pleasantly surprised. But it isn't all sunshine and roses in the water field for legislation. There were some good bills that we really hope to see go through that did die at the last minute, or they were just recently vetoed over the weekend. So I'm going to go through those pretty quickly. The first one is one that was filed pretty early and gained a lot of momentum pretty early, but died fairly late in the session. It would have created a groundwater science research and innovation fund under the Texas Water Development Board, which was very exciting for us. Groundwater science is still pretty opaque in that there's just not a lot of money there for it, and there's a lot of data that could still be acquired and used. We were pretty bummed about that, but then we were excited because the state budget actually has a line item in it that dedicates funding to Texas Water Development Board for just this thing. So we were bummed and then really excited, but I still wanted to include it in this just to show kind of the process of the legislature. Another one that would have been really, really good to see and died later in the session, so it got further than we thought, but not as far as we wanted, was a bill that would have directed the state to study the effects of PFAS, the forever chemicals that you hear a lot about, and their effects on public health and how they are impacting our water supplies and our drinking water. I think that would have been a really good bill. It did get some traction, so it's one we're hoping to push more for in the next session. And then similarly, there was a bill that would have required small public drinking water systems, the really small ones, to install higher treatment systems. So just some good common sense bills that would be very protective of the public, and we'll continue to push for them in the next session. There were also quite a few water conservation bills that gained a lot of traction, made it pretty far, but very, very late in the session died just because they ran out of time. There were some bills that would have increased the permitting requirements for water conservation for new developments, especially in the Hill Country, which would have been really great to see. And then there were some bills that would have jointly allowed for counties to grant property tax exemptions for people who implement water conservation measures such as gray water recycling or rainwater harvesting on their properties. Again, these all made it pretty far, so we're hopeful that if we can get them filed and some support behind them sooner next session, we could make sure they get to the finish line before running out of time. And then unfortunately, Sunday, we found out that there were these bills that we thought were good to go. They had passed both chambers. They had been sent to the governor and they hadn't yet been vetoed. But on the last day that they could be vetoed, which was Sunday, the 22nd, they were. Two of these would have dealt with groundwater specifically. The first one would have increased the notification requirements for groundwater conservation districts to tell each other, to tell other districts, and then to tell the public and the local governments whether they were considering transferring groundwater out of their district. The more of those we see, the more export permits and transferring, the more we think that this is a bill that really needs to happen. But unfortunately, it didn't make it this session because it passed both chambers. It's definitely one we're going to push for next session, and I think we'll have a lot more weight behind it. And then one of the ones that you may have heard about because it's on the governor's list is Senate Bill 1253. It would have provided local governments credit, or it would have provided developers credits on local governments' impact fees if they promised and actually followed up on developing water conservation methods. So whether they implemented rainwater harvesting on all their properties or recycled water or anything like that that would have helped water conservation, they could have received a credit on impact fees. It also, at the very last minute, had an amendment that we were in favor of the original bill. This bill was amended to include the other one. We were in favor of both. The other bill that became an amendment on this bill increased the authority of the Hayes Trinity Groundwater Conservation District. It brought it up to the same level of authority of every other groundwater conservation district in the state. Unfortunately, that amendment seems to be what killed this bill, according to the governor's veto memo, but he has added it as a special session item. So we'll keep an eye on where that ends up next month. Now for the unfortunate part of the presentation, more unfortunate than the good bills that died is the bad bills, the bills that we were opposed to and advocating against that did end up passing and were signed by the governor. Thankfully, there weren't as many as there could have been, which you'll see in a moment. But those that were there are pretty rough. They're not ones, of course, that we are supportive of in any way, and they could have some pretty serious impacts. But I think, thankfully, and you'll see in a couple slides, it could have been far worse. One of the ones that kind of slipped through at the very last minute was House Bill 49. That bill preemptively shields all members of the produced water supply chain from any liability for the harms caused by produced water. And produced water is the water created during the oil and gas drilling process. And it's full of chemical constituents at concentrations that are not public or legally required to be public. And it's a very, very new technology that needs a lot more regulation and a lot more science behind it before we and many other groups in our area feel that it can be reasonably and protectively used. So preemptively shielding any of the people or the groups on the supply chain for that is very concerning. Their argument is that it's safe and enough to use, and we ask if it's safe enough to use, why do you need to be preemptively shielded? But this is one that we're going to continue to watch. It does thankfully direct TCEQ to develop regulations regarding produced water use. So that was a addition to the bill that we and other groups do support, because if it is going to be used, it does need regulations. Some of the other bills are further preemptions of city and county authority. One of them limits city government's ability to impose development moratoriums, and it does not create any exceptions for times of severe drought or water shortage, which is when some cities in the Hill Country, and I'm sure in other parts of Texas, were implementing development moratoriums due to a lack of water supply. And this bill would restrict their ability to do so, which is fairly concerning. And then there are some bills that just are further restrictions on cities and agencies' abilities to do what they consider in their best interests. And now for the other exciting part, the bad bills that failed to pass this session. There were some doozies out there this session that thankfully GEAA and a lot of other groups advocated very strongly for and advocated very strongly against, excuse me, and did in fact die. A lot of these at the very, very last minute, like the last day that they could have died, they did, which was very exciting to see. One of them would have prevented local governments from using any funds to address climate or pollution. So any public funds, even if those funds were received as private donations or grants. And it was billed as an overreach, an anti-climate overreach bill by cities. But one of the most concerning things in our view is that it prevented any money from being spent on projects that stopped pollutants from reaching the environment, but it did not clarify what pollutants meant or what it meant by the environment. So it's just a very broad, very dangerous bill. Thankfully, it did die quite at the last minute, but there was a lot of organized effort on getting that bill killed. Another one that you might have heard of, especially if you are signed up to our alerts or other groups in the Hill Country, was Senate Bill 1927. This was the ash juniper bill, if you've heard of that. It would have prevented cities from protecting ash juniper trees through their city tree ordinances. This bill was really concerning to us because ash juniper trees are the only home of the endangered golden cheek warbler, but they also are really important for land use rules, for soil health, for watershed health, and for protecting the aquifer. So this bill was one that we were very concerned about, and we organized with other groups to get killed. And it also, at quite the last minute, I think it was the last week of the session, we felt fairly confident it was killed, and it did die. And then a couple others were attempted additions to the extraterritorial jurisdiction bill of last session that you may have seen some of our reports on. Last session, it was SB, so Senate Bill 2038, that allowed any properties in the extraterritorial jurisdiction of a city, so that buffer bubble around cities, to disannex themselves without city approval from that buffer. These two bills at the bottom, 2522 and 2523, would have expanded that bill a lot further this session. And one of them, the one in the bottom middle, 2522, was very, very concerning to us and a lot of our partners and stakeholders, because it would have restricted counties from governing the safe, orderly, and healthful development in the county. That one's obviously concerning, especially in a fast growth and high drought area like we are in the Hill Country. And so we monitored that one pretty closely, and it also made it farther than we had hoped. But again, it did fail in the last week, which was really great to see. There were also a lot of other expansions of what was called the Death Star bill that was passed in 2023. These further expansions of that bill would have included measures to potentially defund cities that the state determined were in opposition to any of the measures of the Death Star bill, which was very concerning to us because there weren't any details or rules on what that meant. So it looked like it was a bill that could have been used to kneecap local governments pretty strongly. There were also some bills that would given a lot of powers to attorney generals to target businesses and nonprofits. There were some bills that would have limited the legal recourses available to Texans for any impacts to public health, welfare, or property. And then there were some bills that we were really concerned about, specifically in our region, because of the significant impact they would have on water conservation and on groundwater supplies. Thankfully, all of these as well did die, and we're hopeful that they won't be resurrected next session, but we'll know to keep an eye on them in case they pop up again. So that's a quick, fast overview of everything that did happen in the legislative session. Again, I'll link at the very last slide to where you can find more details if you're interested in finding out more about each of the individual bills I talked about, or some bills that I didn't get to. But I want to highlight real fast our next steps here at the Greater Edwardsburg Alliance. The first one is tying back to the first slide that I talked about for the bills that did pass. The House Joint Resolution 7, the funding constitutional amendment for the big water bill this session, is going to be on the Texas general election ballot as a ballot measure on Tuesday, November 14th, the general election. We do not know yet which ballot measure it will be, so I can't unfortunately tell you the name of the ballot measure, but it will be the ballot measure that dedicates $20 billion in funding over the next 20 years to Texas water supply and infrastructure. We do strongly encourage you to vote yes on the amendment. The big water bills that were passed this session will not have as much meaning if this constitutional amendment fails in November. But we will be sure to keep all of our members and anyone signed up for alerts updated on the ballot measures and on any steps you can take this summer and fall to help see it through. And then we're going to, even though it's not any, there's no session next year, there is a special session this summer. We'll keep an eye on anything that happens there that might be of interest to our area. But we're going to start the process for the next session beginning this summer and fall. We will continue to advocate for interim charges, which I'll get into on the next slide. We will be sure to share our resources and our research with lawmakers during the interim session, which will be next year. We'll be sure to testify if we are granted that opportunity, and to really make sure that we have all of our ducks in a row and are able to start getting some of those bills that I talked about that didn't go through this past session pre-filed for next session. So hopefully we can get them through faster and make sure they're passed next session. And then before you know it, it'll be January of 2027 and the 90th Texas legislature will begin. So the interim charges we're going to focus on, there are three broad ones that we would like the state to look into in advance of the next session. One will be expanding county authority to deal with the impacts of dramatic development and population growth at the same time as dramatic decreases in water availability and increases in drought. We're going to see if we can get the state to look into expanding wastewater recycling and see about getting some of our ideas on there examined. And then we're going to look into having the state research expanding water availability reporting requirements and study requirements for new developments that go in unincorporated counties. So if any of those are interested to you, just keep an eye out for any of our work or emails about those three interim charges. But that'll, I think, be plenty to keep us busy over the next year or so as we gear up again for the next legislative session. So I know that's a lot to take in at once. A lot did happen in a short 140 days, so it's hard to condense it all down, but if you have any questions about any of those, we'll take some for the remaining half of the Water Wonks lecture. But otherwise, my email is here, our website is here, and then you're welcome to read any of our legislative recaps, our bill overviews, any of the comments we submitted during testimony on various bills at our legislation tab under our library on our website. So I think that's, yes, my last slide, and we'll be happy to open it up to questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Rachel. I appreciate the intel and your knowledge and all this. So just a reminder, I am going to be going to the chat feature first for Q&A. So if you have any questions or comments right now, please utilize the chat feature. Once we get through it, I will open up to the floor if there's any other questions remaining. So the first question I have, Rachel, for you, it's more related to just generally speaking. Annalisa also has commented on it by providing our Under Our Feet website, and it's from Cindy, who's asking, generally asking, is there a finite supply of water? And if so, where does the water come from for the thousands upon thousands of new housing developments? So kind of kind of getting more of a better perspective in terms of, water demand versus, increased development demand as well.
Yeah, I guess I think the people in the water industry themselves might have a different answer, but I think in the grand scheme of thing, in terms of feasibility, it would be good to look at water supplies as a finite supply. There's ways to add new supply, and certain people in the state have differing opinions on what those will be. I mean, in the so far as you can do wastewater recycling and rainwater harvesting and gray water recycling, you can continue that cycle and kind of have a loop of water supply that maybe not is necessarily considered finite. But in terms of surface water supplies, just straight pulling water out of the rivers and lakes in our region and pumping water out of groundwater aquifers. I think it is helpful to consider those as a finite supply. You know, big rainstorms and floods can change that, but the general predictions of those have fairly finite numbers. And so the water for the new developments, some of the times, I think we and other groups believe that that water doesn't exist for new developments that are coming in, and but plenty of people are looking into that. And I think Annalisa just popped on, so she might have some further information on
Yeah.
that.
I mean, the fact of the matter is, we're in dire straits. I mean, some people are predicting that some areas could run out of water as soon as 2030. Um, what we're looking at here is we have groundwater and surface water in Texas. The surface water permits are already over permitted. So if everybody who had a permit to withdraw water from our rivers did so at once, those rivers would go dry. The current state of the Edwards Aquifer, uh, uh, it is already permitted to the maximum amount. So people who want to get water from the Edwards Aquifer now have to buy permits from other people who already have those permits. So we're looking at finite supplies. You've got some good things that as HJR7 could fund, such as aquifer storage and recovery, which we think is a great plan where you take floodwaters and when you have excess water and store it underground rather than in the surface water reservoir. We have brackish water desalination, where you're taking brackish groundwater and desalinating. And then, as Rachel mentioned, we're really underutilized our reuse water. That could be a huge source of additional water supply. But it's also going to require Texans, I think, especially in our part of Texas, to rethink the way that we use water. Because seriously, in summertime, in most of our communities within Central Texas, half of that water use is going to water lawns.
Okay, thanks, and hope that answers your question, Cindy. And again, just want to mention that Annalisa Pease is our executive director of the Greater Edwards River Alliance. Failed to mention that, but she included our Under Our Feet website that can also add some more context to your question. So hope that helps you and hope that clarifies your question. Rachel, going to the chat, just a bunch of people are excited for certain bills, like Jess Wright from the City of House is excited for HB Step 517. Suzanne says excited for SB 2662. And then I'm going to go back to Jess's question. And I think we might want to just clarify. She's asking about HB 2559. And that's relating to the imposition by a municipality of a moratorium property development. I guess the question is saying like HB 2559 limits the city's ability to impose a moratorium. How does that work if the city will literally run out of water?
Yeah, it's a really fair question. I listened in on the hearing for this. We submitted comments on this bill. It is very concerning. I think if nothing else, the city should have the ability to impose development moratoriums. in times of water shortage. So if they were going to do this bill, they should have included a measure for that. One thing, if the drought keeps getting worse and population and development keeps increasing, especially in our region, there would certainly, I would hope, be movement next session on, if not just scrapping this bill, at least getting an amendment to this bill that qualifies that you can have a property moratorium in times of water shortage. But it's a great question. I'm not sure what'll happen once as this first city to run into that. I would hope they would all call their legislators.
Yeah, thank you. And I know Annalisa had briefly touched on the last question about how outdoor irrigation was the main driver of residential water use. Uh, a follow-up to Jess's questions asking what could potential policy look like for developers and home builders, and also what might state law look like in that regard. And Jess, I know you said it's a naive question. There's no naive questions. It's always a good conversation to have.
No, it's a great question. I think, and one thing we really pushed for, and some bills that made it fairly far, just not as far as we would have hoped, is to increase building and development and landscaping codes and standards. Counties are very, very hamstrung in their ability to enforce building codes and standards, and definitely hamstrung in their ability to go beyond anything that the state requires as a minimum level. Cities are able to go beyond what the state does, but even so, they're still restricted in how far beyond they can go. So, raising the level of what counties and cities can implement and enforce in terms of building codes, development codes, landscaping codes, and standards would be extremely helpful. I think there's a lot of pushback still. Those bills that I was mentioning that made it a fair way but didn't pass, there was a lot of pushback from builders groups and development groups. So it's just needing to overcome that pushback and needing to make clear that these are things that are going to need to happen if the Texas miracle, the economic and housing booms that we're seeing are going to continue, that we need to figure out a different way to do it that doesn't use as much water.
Thank you for that. And just to bring to your attention, it looks like Rachel C has linked a lot of information from the San Antonio water system about their drought restrictions. It looks like there's two messages about that regard, so I encourage you to look into those as well. And thank you, Rachel, for sharing those. I appreciate it. Next question I have on my list is from Terry Marsh, and it kind of builds into another question that Pam Peck privately messaged me about AI, the data centers becoming more and more prominent. And the question is more about any thoughts on the interim charges regarding the impact of data centers on the increasing water demand.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be interesting. I think we saw we we've seen a lot of news articles and information regarding data centers prior to the legislative session over the past few years, but it seemed like once the legislative session ended, all of a sudden there was a raft of articles and permits filed for new data centers in our region, which of course is pretty concerning considering how much water they're known to use. I would say in terms of whether they will be studied in an interim charge, the first thing I would say is it does seem like there is a lot of movement behind opposing these data centers, or at least wanting to know more. The only way we get interim charges is if groups advocate for them. If you call your legislators and ask for them, if you push the heads of the committees to add them to their requests. So it'll really be a citizen-led movement, I think, in terms of getting interim charges on the schedule. We do at GEAA hope to look into it this, I would say probably fall and spring on data centers. It's something we definitely want to look into. But if people are very concerned about it, it's anything that you would like your legislators to look at as an interim charge. Call, email, ask them to go ask the Speaker of the House or the Lieutenant Governor to put that on. And I think there's a lot of political movement behind these right now, considering how often they've been in the news. So it could be something that's easier to get on the interim schedule than it would seem.
Okay, thank you for that, Rachel. I appreciate it. Terry and Pam, hope that answers your questions with that. If it doesn't, feel free to do a follow-up and we'll get back to that as well. The next question I have is actually from my friend Ryan Petter up in Travis County. Good to see you. I'm gonna read this question fully because it ties in regarding SB7 and HB 49. So kind of gonna read it all first, and then we can go track it one by one. So he's asking, in regards to SB7, since it will provide funding to reuse projects that Texas Water Development Board approves, how does this affect Governor Abbott and Texas Ag Commissioner Sid Miller's push for use of produced water for agriculture irrigation? He mentions HB 49 takes away any liability for damages caused by produced water. So will that make the Texas Water Development Board absorb any liability, damages caused, or pull funding from other projects of SB7? And the final comment to that, he says, is currently the TCQ does not have any standards that will cover the vast amount of chemicals typically seen within these produced waters.
Yes, that's a great question. It's one I've heard a couple of times recently. So I think step by step, I'm not sure exactly how it would affect the push for produced water. There does seem to be a very large industry-led push to increase the use of produced water in the state. I will say we do not like House Bill 49 because of the preemptive liability shield for folks on the supply chain for produced water. The one provision of the bill we do like is that it does require TCQ rulemaking for the treatment of produced water. I think that's a public process where public comment can weigh in. So that is encouraging to see insofar as it's the bare minimum needed for produced water. Whether TWDB would absorb the liability costs or who would absorb the costs at the end of any damages caused by produced water, that I don't know, whether it be TDWB, TCQ, or, a court could find that, I'm not sure, unfortunately, it's out of my area of expertise on that. But I will say, again, the one provision that we did appreciate in that bill that we really don't like is that it does require TCQ to undergo rulemaking for produced water. And there are other bills related to water recycling, not just the produced water, but for municipal wastewater recycling. So Senate Bill 2885, which allows for treated recycled water to be used in for storage and recovery project. That one also has a provision of the law that will require TCQ to undergo rulemaking before any treated wastewater is used for ASR projects.
And I'd like to add, the prospect of using produced water from oil and gas operations on agriculture or releasing it into our rivers and streams or any of those is really alarming. But I think it's cleaning up that water is going to be enormously expensive. And right now, when you're looking at your price points, it's simply not affordable for farmers to be purchasing that type of water. So I think we have somewhat of a grace period before we actually start seeing this happening. So it's up to us to get involved and make sure that the state is going to put in the regulations that if we're going to be using that water, it will be safe.
Awesome. Thank you, Rachel and Annalisa. I appreciate your input. And Ryan, hope that answers your question. Let me know if it doesn't or we want to continue that conversation. I'm going to still keep on Senate Bill 7 with the next question I have from Kenneth. Kenneth asks, will SB7, if passed, allow for funding for groundwater aquifer research and modeling, or is it limited to building and repairing infrastructure?
I do think SB7 specifically is limited to the new water supply projects and to water infrastructure projects. However, the Senate Bill 1, the state budget bill, does allocate funds. I think it's 7 billion, billion or million. I need to check how much it is. a fairly large number, all things considered, to the Texas Water Development Board over the next 2 years to provide grants to groundwater conservation districts to allow them to conduct this type of research for groundwater research science and data collection. So not Senate Bill 7, but yes, Senate Bill 1 does have money for this.
Thanks, Rachel, and hope that answers your question, Kenneth. It looks like Brian Zepchek, thanks, Brian. He mentions HB1 groundwater research is 7.5 billion over the next 2 years. So thanks, Brian, for that intel. We appreciate it. Let's see. The next question I have is from Stuart Bourbon. Good to see you as well, Stuart. He is asking about for the legislation that expands water reuse, are there components of the legislation that addresses the water quality or treatment needed prior to reuse?
Yes. So like I said earlier, the bills that do relate as far as I'm aware, any of the bills that do relate to new types of treated water recycling, so the produced water or the treated wastewater recycling into ASR projects, do have a component that also requires new TCQ rulemaking for those types of projects and for that treatment. I don't think Senate Bill 7, as good as it is, it doesn't talk about all of that. So when it's saying there can be money for wastewater and water reuse projects, it doesn't necessarily get into TCQ's rulemaking, but TCQ does already have rulemaking for more standard wastewater recycling projects.
Okay, thank you, Rachel and Stuart. Hope that answers your question. Let me see. Tying back to our first conversation we had with Cindy and Annalise and Rachel both chiming in about is water a finite supply? Key comments, while I agree that water is a finite resource, I believe that the bigger issue is water usage in line with what Annalise has said earlier. So, Joe, thanks for your comment. We appreciate that. It looks like that's the end of the questions I have formally on the chat. Is there any other outstanding questions, comments? We still got a little bit of time, so you can still use a chat feature, or if we want to do something a little bit more informal, you can just use the raise your hand chat feature and reaction feature, and I can call on you to make an open discussion here.
And
Where's the
thanks,
raise your
Brian,
hand
for.
feature?
Oh, sorry. I was just going to point out that Brian answered the question and provided more detail on what standards current wastewater recycling projects have to meet. So yeah, that's Chapter 210 under TCQ's rulemaking. Sorry, Cindy, go ahead.
Where's the raise your hand feature?
Oh, it's okay. If you have a question right now, I see your microphone's unmuted,
Yeah,
so just
so
go ahead.
in terms of my comment regarding all of these new developments, housing, apartment complex, commercial, do the builders have that much influence to get these bills killed? Because what every neighborhood needs is another nail salon.
Yes.
I mean, is their influence that
They do.
big?
Yes, it's really big. There are times that we would have legislation that we thought was fairly mundane, a pretty small fix that shouldn't impact developments or builders that much. And we would show up to testify, and it would be us in support and a builders lobby group in opposition, even though we had tried to keep it quiet. So, and those bills died. So again, I think they're even in the face of how strong the builder and development groups are, there were some really good pieces of legislation that went through that we were kind of surprised to see. And there were some bills that made it much further along than we thought, even though the builders lobby testified against them. But on the whole, it is usually pretty concerning when on bills that we support, if we show up to testify and we see that a builders group is there on the other side of it.
Yeah, and I'm going to add that aggravating that is that Texans have a propensity to elect representatives to the legislature who don't like regulation. And so when we move forward with trying to uh, better manage our water supplies so that we protect water quality and all. I've heard that over and over and over through the years. I don't like regulation. Is there some other way we can do this? But with the increases in population and water use and the current conditions, uh, doing things on a voluntary basis just is not practical anymore.
I live out in Fulshire, one of the fastest growing communities in Texas, and the amount of growth and development we have is out of control. And again, how many Whataburgers, on every corner do you need? How many liquor stores do you need? I don't see. I just can't understand it. I mean, that these commercial building strip centers and things like that are they're out of control. They really are. And how do we stop them?
Thank you, Cindy.
How do we stop them?
We're trying to get rational, responsible legislation passed. So I would say, keep an eye on what happens over the next year and a half at the legislature. Now's the time for anyone who wants greater city and county authority to respond to the impacts of increased development, increased drought. Now is the time to establish a relationship with your legislature, to bring your concerns to them, to get your community groups and to participate in groups like GEAA, to be aware and informed. And we'll keep you updated. Don't worry.
Thank you.
But now is the time as they head into their election and their primary and the general election next year, of making sure they're aware that these are issues that are important to you.
Yeah. Okay. My rant is over.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Cindy. We appreciate your effort. We appreciate your attendance and asking these questions. It's always a discussion that we're having as well. So you're not alone. You're not alone. Just reminding you about that. Let's see. I do have one last question. It looks like back from Kenneth, talking about HB1. Is it SB1 or HB1?
It's the developers.
Is it SB1 or HB1? I'm not too sure, but it says, does SB1 need voter approval or is it a done deal?
SB1, so the state budget, I believe, is a done deal. Like, we do not need to vote on that. SB7 is also a done deal. We don't need to vote on that. The funding mechanism for SB7, the big water funding bill, is House Joint Resolution 7. It's a constitutional amendment, and that will need voter approval in the fall. So again, I wish I could tell you what the name of the ballot measure would be. We won't know that for quite a long time until the ballots were published, but rest assured, the minute we know what number it'll be, we'll let everyone know which one we advocate for voting yes on.
Yeah, and I'm going to add, because I'm getting a lot of emails of people who are confused about what's going to be funded, but this $1 billion a year is a drop in the bucket of what is needed for Texans. And so we're urging all of y'all, if you hear people talking about it or whatever, to get in front of it. One of the good talking points, I think, and I think what a lot of the money is going to be used for, is fixing Texas's outdated and leaky water infrastructure. And as Rachel mentioned, we are losing more water through leaky water infrastructure, than what is used annually by the cities of Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, and Austin. And that's pretty awful. So, if your friends or whatever are talking about it, you can, like I said, I urge you to get out in front of it, and we will be sending more information on that up until November.
Thank you, Annalisa. I appreciate that. So I have 1 minute till 4:30. So let's see. Any other questions, comments? I would say speak now or forever hold your peace. I will mention that Rachel C. has shared another link regarding what Senator Jose Menendez said about water conservation in response to a question she was allowed to ask during the Texas Tribune San Antonio San Antonio and the 2025 legislative session recap at St. Mary's that was held on June 18th, yes, excuse me. So she has a link to that YouTube link if you want to hear what Jose Menendez said about that. Also, Rachel mentioned that Texas Living Waters has great information on leaky pipes and water losses for those interested as well. So yes, I've been getting a lot of comments and questions about the recording, the slides, things of that sorts. We will have it posted on the Aquifer Alliance website at our the page where you go to sign up for our GEAA Water Wonks. That will be readily available. After the recording, I will getting exported and working with our office manager to get that up on our website. We always aim to get it up by the end of the week, so be on the lookout for that. I will also share a link for our next Water Wonks Lecture Series in July. We are going to have Daniel Perry, who is an ecological engineer with the San Antonio River Authority, to give an overview about the 2D modeling efforts for flood risk planning that Sarah is doing on San Antonio's West Side Creeks. So really good conversation we're going to have next July, in July. The URL I shared, the registration will be up tomorrow and active. So just keep that on your radar, keep on your looks, and we will also be promoting it as well. So with that, if there's no more questions or comments, I am going to conclude today's Water Wonks. Thank you again to our presenter, Rachel Haynes, for a great conversation and just some great Q&A. So with that, I bid everyone farewell and have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you all.